On August 21st, 1992, U.S. Marshals rolled up to this area called Ruby Ridge near Naples, Idaho. They were on a mission to find a guy named Randy Weaver. Randy was an alleged white supremacist who was wanted by the federal government for selling 2 illegal sawed-off firearms to an undercover informant. He was supposed to go to trial for the weapon charges but never showed up. He basically hated anyone who wasn't a white male and was obsessed with firearms. Like, he'd sleep in a flak jacket with a loaded weapon under his pillow. Randy absolutely hated the government and had attended several Aryan Nation meetings, which is why he is often labeled a white supremacist. Randy's wife, Vicky, was super into the fundamentalist movement. She believed there was an apocalypse on the horizon, so in order to survive it, she convinced Randy to move away from the corrupt civilization. The family then bought a 20-acre piece of land in Ruby Ridge, Idaho, and built a cabin. In total, Randy and Vicky had 4 kids who were all homeschooled. Randy taught his children to walk around the property with firearms, and he'd often send his armed kids out in front of him to greet strangers. Also, Vicky had to give birth to their 4th child in the shed because Randy believed a woman giving birth was unclean. After Randy was clocked for the firearm charges in 1989, ATF agents tried to cut him a deal. They said that they would drop the charges if Randy agreed to an informant on the Aryan Nation's white supremacy group. Now to that, Randy replied, "You can go to hell!" And then after the incident, Vicky addressed a letter to the Aryan Nations and all our brethren of the Anglo-Saxon race, where she warned them that the government was trying to rat them out. She also wrote a letter to the U.S. Attorney for Idaho, whom she addressed as the servant of the Queen of Babylon. She told the attorney, "We will not bow to your evil commandments, whether we live or whether we die." The FBI took that as a direct threat. So when Randy failed to appear in court on multiple occasions, a warrant was issued for his arrest. The authorities knew this would be a very difficult and potentially dangerous arrest, so they secretly monitored the Weavers before taking action. And that brings us back to the morning of August 21st when 6 U.S. Marshals went to Randy's property to search it. They were looking for a secluded spot away from the cabin that would be a good place to catch and arrest Randy without causing them any harm. The Marshals were told to avoid any interaction with Randy, and they tried. I mean, these dudes were dressed head to toe in camo. They also had night vision goggles and carried M16 rifles just in case. And at around 10:45, the operation was almost complete, and it seemed to have gone off without a hitch. As 3 of the Marshals walked down a hill to join the others, the Weavers' yellow lab, Stryker, caught a whiff of them. Oh no, here we go. The Marshals noticed Stryker and started freaking out. They ran to a small clearing by the cabin, but it was too late. The Weavers had already heard Stryker barking like he always did when there was a stranger. Randy went out to try and find out who Stryker was barking at. His 14-year-old son, Sammy, and friend, Kevin, also went out to investigate, but they went off in another direction. Sammy and Kevin were super excited because they thought Stryker noticed a game animal and they were fresh out of meat at the cabin. But as the 2 followed Stryker with firearms in hand, the dog led them to 3 Marshals. When one of the Marshals, named Larry, saw Kevin behind the dog, he yelled,
"Back off, U.S. Marshal!"
Right after that, another Marshal, Billy, came out from behind a tree stump and screamed,
"Freeze, U.S. Marshal!"
Shortly after that, bullets rang out. And it's still not clear who fired first, but according to the Marshals, Kevin hit Billy in the chest first. It was a fatal blow. In response, Larry then fired at Kevin several times but missed. The 3rd Marshal, Roderick, was a bit further away from Billy and Larry, but was worried that the 3 other Marshals would be found out by strikers, so he fired at the dog to prevent that from happening. Somewhere along the way, Randy's son Sammy was hit in the back with a bullet and ended up passing away. The Marshals apparently didn't know this until later, and they claimed to have no idea that had happened, which is pretty concerning. I mean, according to Kevin, this is how the incident went down. Roderick first took out Stryker. Sammy then screamed, "You killed my dog, you son of a," and started firing at the Marshals. One of the Marshals, presumably Billy, returned the favor with several bullets, knocking Sammy to the ground. Kevin said it was then that he pulled the trigger on Billy, and in the end, Billy the Marshal, Stryker the dog, and Sammy the son were all lifeless. After the bullets ceased, the Weavers took Sammy's body and placed it in their shed. Then they retreated to their cabin, probably to gather more weapons and make a game plan for the next attack. When the Marshals reported Billy's demise, FBI's officials decided to change their tactics. They went back on their rule to not fire at Randy. At this point, if he was armed, which he was, officers were told they could and should use lethal force as long as the child wasn't in the way. They even stated no request for surrender or announcement of officials' presence would be needed to shoot. The FBI then filled in their top snipers from the hostage rescue team and sent them out to Ruby Ridge. The snipers arrived the following morning, and they were ready to take Randy Weaver down once and for all. They took their positions and waited for the perfect opportunity to knock out Randy without ever asking him to surrender. Randy, his buddy Kevin, and his 16-year-old daughter Sarah were spotted headed to the shed to visit Sammy's body. As Randy extended his arm to open the shed door, one of the FBI marksmen, Lon, had the perfect shot. He aimed for Randy's spine, but after pulling the trigger, Randy moved, which caused the bullet to hit him right in the right shoulder. With that, Randy, Kevin, and Sarah ran back into the cabin where Vicky opened the door and helped them get inside. But Lon wasn't done. He aimed his weapon and fired again. This time, the bullet went through Vicky's brain and landed in Kevin's chest. Yeah, it's graphic, I know. Vicky, who was holding her 10-month-old baby, instantly fell to the ground and met her demise. Kevin was still alive, but he was badly injured. A few hours later, after Kevin was hit, he started coughing up red fluid. He was in so much pain that he asked Randy to finish him off, but Randy said, "Kevin, I can't do that." Later that day, a government vehicle approached the cabin to announce that the law enforcement officers were present. Yeah, no duh. The Weavers said it was the first time that they were notified of the officers, which is something typically done before opening fire. For the next 10 days, there was a huge standoff between the FBI and the Weavers. They were trying to reach a peaceful negotiation, and neither side would budge. Randy, his 3 surviving children, and Kevin all stayed in the cabin, and Vicky's body was still in there too. They covered her up with a blanket. And as for the 350 to 400 marshals and FBI agents on site, they stayed at a temporary camp nicknamed Camp Vicky. Yeah, like the name of the woman the sniper executed. They would literally wake up in the morning and call out to the cabin.
Good morning, Mrs. Weaver. We had pancakes this morning. What did you have for breakfast? Why don't you send your children out here for some pancakes, Mrs. Weaver?
Like, isn't that terrible? The authorities said they didn't know Vicky was lifeless, but most people doubt that. A lot of those who followed the case believe the officers said things like that to taunt the surviving Weavers in the house. Based on the way things were going, Randy and Kevin wrote a 6-page letter to detail their side of the confrontation, just in case something happened to them. There seemed to be no end in sight, other than a violent one, and they needed to find something to do while cooped up in the cabin all those days, right? Once word got out about the standoff, a bunch of neo-Nazis from the local Aryan nations showed up to protest. All of these angry protesters poured into Ruby Ridge from as far as Las Vegas and Portland. They met at the Ruby Creek Bridge for a vigil to take a stand against the authorities. Among the attendees was Bo Gritz. He was a former Green Beret, big conspiracy theorist and right-winger who once ran for president of the United States on the Populist Party ticket. Anyway, Bo acted as a mediator between Randy and the FBI, and on August 30th, he and a few others convinced Kevin to surrender and get medical assistance. The following day, Bo got the Weavers to surrender. He told Randy that a famous defense attorney agreed to take on the case, and that's what sealed the deal for Randy. After the Weavers stepped down, Bo said, "There's a bureaucrat up here that's guilty. Somebody's going to be brought to justice. I believe we're going to find some fat bureaucrat who authorized this to go down." While the standoff ended more peacefully than it could have, the FBI had another metaphorical fire to put out. One caused by them granting the snipers permission to attack without sufficient provocation. After the standoff was over, Kevin was indicted for the slaughter of the U.S. Marshal Billy. Randy was charged on a total of 10 counts, including the original firearm charges from 1989 and aiding and abetting in Billy's demise. Randy's attorney claimed his client acted out in self-defense. And after hearing witness statements, the judge dismissed 2 of Randy's counts but upheld the other 8. Every bit counts, I guess. At the trial, the prosecution painted Randy as a government-hating white supremacist who essentially caused the battle due to his stubbornness, refusal to comply with the police, and of course, his illegal stockpile of weapons. The prosecution also brought up all of Vicky's threatening letters, labeling them as another instigator to the standoff. The defense attorney leaned into the topics of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and self-defense. Oh, God. Yeah, Randy is racist and goes to Aryan Nation meetings, but he's not technically a white supremacist. And Vicky's letters weren't threats. She was simply exercising her freedom of speech. Oh my God, I hate him. Both sides focused a lot on the first incident where Sammy, Billy, and Stryker lost their lives. The prosecution claimed Billy was horrifically slain for no reason. But the defense was all like, "Yo, y'all fired first." Larry, one of the marshals who was at the scene of the crime, took the stand to share his side of the story. He said Kevin fired at Billy first, and that's what started it all. But then, during the defense attorney's cross-examination, Larry admitted that Billy's weapon was missing 7 rounds. Which meant Kevin's story of Billy firing at Sammy could very well be true. Because if you remember, the marshals couldn't explain how Sammy got hit. So maybe they could explain it, but chose not to in an effort to cover up their tracks. That's a little shady, huh? I mean, the defense attorney also pointed out how strange it was that Roderick fired at the dog. He was like, did the dog do anything that was illegal? Man, this guy's good. One of the witnesses brought to testify for the prosecution was a family friend of the Weavers. His name was Rodney. Rodney talked all about how Randy hated the government and expressed plans to never surrender. But on cross-examination, Rodney spoke about how much Randy and Vicky loved one another. He said Vicky was super scared that the government was going to rip her kids away from her and put them in the welfare system, which really pulled on the jury's heartstrings. So it was almost like Rodney did more good for the defense than he did for the prosecution. But here's where things started to look really bad for the Weavers. Prosecutors showed the jury a cart of 14 firearms and 4,500 rounds of ammo that allegedly belonged to the Weavers. They also played surveillance videos of the kids running around the property with loaded weapons. And this is where the jury really started to see how violent, dangerous, and unpredictable Randy was. It also showed how bad his parenting skills were. Like, dang. As much as the prosecution tried to get their point across, the defense was super quick to point out their faults. One of the biggest and most controversial events from the standoff at Ruby Ridge was the FBI permitting snipers to fire without warning or provocation. Lon, the marksman who knocked out Vicky, was brought up to share his side of the story. He said he didn't mean to execute Vicky and didn't see her in the doorway, but was aware of the possibilities when he pulled the trigger. Well, after the court adjourned for the day, the prosecuting attorney, Ron, went back to his office where he found a package on his desk. In the package was a horrific drawing on a hotel notepad that depicted the trajectory of the bullet that hit Vicky, including 2 circles that represented heads. The drawing was made by none other than the FBI sniper Lon, just one day after Vicky's demise. This proved he did know Vicky was standing there that day and meant to whack her. Ron reported the note, and Lon was forced to appear in front of the jury again, this time to explain his drawing. Let's just say things weren't looking good for Lon or the prosecution. Throughout the whole trial, the defense was extremely strategic. Their job wasn't to make the Weavers seem like saints, it was to make the jury doubt the FBI's intentions. They were able to manipulate many of the prosecutor's witnesses into saying things that they supported the defense, and most interesting of all, the defense didn't present any witnesses of their own. The Weavers' attorney said Sarah was too honest and would probably admit that she wore swastikas, stole from people, and used extremely racist nicknames. Wow, that's pretty annoying that the defense tried to brush that under the rug. And in the end, Kevin's charges were acquitted, and Randy was found guilty on 1 count, failure to appear in court. He was forced to pay a $10,000 fine and sentenced to 18 months in prison. But by that point, he had already served 14 months, so he just had a few more months until he would be set free. The Weavers attempted to file a lawsuit, but in 1995, they were paid off over $3 million by the government. Kevin also attempted to sue the government, but federal officials stated they would never pay him off because he whacked a U.S. Marshal. But in September of 2000, they were forced to cave, and Kevin was given a $380,000 settlement. That is insane! Like, I can't believe those criminals are literally being paid after what they did. I don't know how to feel about it. In 1997, Lon, the sniper, faced involuntary manslaughter charges for executing Vicky Weaver. Over the next few years, there was a bit of a back and forth, but in the end, his charges were dropped because the prosecutor didn't think that the state could prove the case and too much time had passed. So, even though the standoff at Ruby Ridge was over, it was an event that sparked the modern-day militia movement that's exponentially grown into the past few years. Right-wing people saw Randy as a hero and a lone ranger of the law who exercises freedom and rights. Now, as for me, I think Randy was a narcissist who should have just shown up in court back in 1989. He also shouldn't have taught his kids to run around with firearms or made his wife give birth in the shed. Now, even still, I think it's pretty concerning the way the FBI handled the standoff. And can we talk about the demented campground name? That's just messed up. You know what isn't messed up? Frying cheese ravioli. Frying cheese ravioli. I mean, look at these things. They're gorgeous. I legit think that this may be one of the world's greatest innovations. Like, actually. Guys, thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.